As Father Byron said on Thursday night, the issue is not religious or metaphysical contempt for the sciences. Orthodox theologians and philosophers, from Augustine to Professor McIntyre, have always held that no truth counsels for any other, and that verified scientific facts are to be respected as such. Newton's law was not shaken by Darwin, any more than Augustine's was when he realized that some astronomical statements in the Old Testament were simply wrong. The issue, rather, is the distinction between acknowledgement of verified facts and the humility and faith, the personal commitment demanded by truth. According to an instructive legend, when Galileo was accused by his students of cowardice for abandoning under pressure from the church his assertion that the earth revolves around the sun, his defence was that one does not die for a fact, which someone sooner or later would establish in influence. I love that story. It may or may not be true. It was a story that was popular and current in science departments in German universities between the wars, which is why I think it was not as old as that. Ancient though I am, it was a distinction clear to Pascal, a brilliant scientist himself, and it was precisely put by Pope Benedict shortly before he became Pope. Modern philosophers, this is Pope Benedict, modern philosophies inspired by the Enlightenment are based on a self-limitation of the positive reason that is adequate in the technological sphere, but entails a mutilation of man if it is generalized. The result is that man no longer accepts any moral authority apart from his own calculations. End of quote. What is at issue in the defence of truth is the education in the broadest sense, the progress towards God, of the soul, the heart, and the mind, not as separable as we sometimes think, of the person. When Newman said, religious truths, unlike scientific truths, cannot take care of themselves, he was making Galileo's point. The commitment to truth is to confronting people one by one, or not at all. Science, Newman said in his lecture on literature in Catholic University in 1958, has to do with things, literature with thoughts. Science is universal, literature is personal. This lecture on literature ends with a magnificent 10-line sentence, which I'm not going to read, the gist of which is his conclusion. If great authors are the spokesmen and prophets of the human family, they will not answer to make light of literature or to neglect its study. In 1854, Newman had said, even to this day, Shakespeare and Milton are not studied in our course of education. He saw that it was time for this to change. In 1856, he appointed Matthew Arnold's erratic convert brother Thomas as professor of English literature in the Catholic University, more a schoolmaster's job than an Oxford chair. It was a significant beginning nonetheless, and the long-established Protestant Trinity College Dublin followed suit with a professorial appointment in modern literature in 1867. And in that same year, Henry Sidgwick, a heavyweight Cambridge philosopher, made a serious case for the study of English literature of the many intelligent students who had never progressed in the classics beyond what he called unmeaning linguistic exercises. Well, it shouldn't take long to progress further than them, but lots of classics teachers don't. Sidgwick, not mentioning girls, though he was a firm supporter of women's education, pleaded that, quote, all boys, whatever their special bent and destination, be really taught literature, so that as far as possible they may learn to enjoy intelligently poetry and eloquence, that some comprehension of the various development of human nature may ever after abide with them, the source and essence of a true humanizing culture. a century would elapse before the work would lose its connotation of high quality. Meanwhile, it was the word of the moment, especially in Germany. And in England, the man of the moment was Thomas Arnold's more famous brother Matthew, whose influential essay, Culture and Anarchy, appeared in 1869. Arnold had been Professor of Poetry at Oxford from 1857 to 1867, the first who was not a Catholic, and the first to lecture in English rather than Latin. The study of literature was central to his project for civilizing Philistine England. In a late lecture called Literature and Science, he defended against T.H. Huxley, the great Victorian explainer of Darwin and coiner of the word agnostic, the merits of the literary education. Arnold maintained that the result of a purely scientific curriculum would be knowledge. Knowledge, this is his phrase, knowledge not put for us into a relation with our sense of contact, our sense of the beauty, and touched with emotion by being so put, not thus put for us, and therefore to the majority of mankind, after a certain while, unsatisfied, weary, and hurt. He couldn't say outright that we will cultivate the soul as well as the mind, if we love goodness and beauty as well as truth. He knew enough about Plato to know where these words lead. If the soul, then God. But Arnold was no less an agnostic than Huxley, and in this same lecture said that the Christian faith which underpinned the medieval universities was anchored in what he called supposed knowledge, what is not, and therefore was not ever true. Arnold's agenda was therefore very different from Newman's. Newman saw the Christian and literary traditions as inseparable. Arnold, though equally keen to protect the humanities from utilitarian priorities, wanted quite specifically to replace Christianity with literary culture as the path to salvation. He thought it no longer possible for an educated person to take Christian dogma seriously. Praising the vague transcendentalism of Wordsworth and Emerson in a lecture in America in 1883, he remembered the Anglican Newman of his own Oxford youth and added of Newman's conversion to Catholicism. His genius and style are still things of power, but he has adopted the doubts and difficulties which beset men's minds today, a solution which, to speak frankly, is impossible. Starvation of the soul cannot be. Food for the soul, however, is not to be looked for in Christian truth, because in Christianity there is moral uplift and a dash of helpful emotion, but certainly no truth. Literature graded by criticism, which he defined in 1865 as a disinterested endeavour to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought in the world, must fill this void. Arnold actually envied the French, their stifling Académie Française, founded by Richelieu in 1630, because England had, quote, no sovereign organ of the highest literary opinion, title for which offers to approval. He made a start himself in the study of poetry. Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, Milton are the poets of high seriousness, his principle, which gives to our spirits what they can rest upon. Poets are sure to become, beyond Shelley's assertion, the acknowledged legislators of the world. Quote, the future of poetry is immense, because in poetry, where it is worthy of its high destinies, our race, as time goes on, will find an ever surer and surer stay. In the generation after Arnold's death, gentlemanly lovers of poetry, Sir Walter Raleigh at Oxford from 1904, and Sir Arthur Quiller at Cambridge from 1912, the first holders of newly funded professorships in English literature, showed no inclination to take up Arnold's challenge. His conscious air, tougher, and with more intellectual grit than Arnold, never mind Raleigh and Quiller ever had, was born in 1895, only 7 years after Arnold's death, and lived, taught, and wrote in Cambridge, his hometown, until he died in 1978. F.R. Lewis was never the Cambridge professor, was regarded with suspicion or scorn by many in the academic and literary worlds, and always thought himself unjustly persecuted or ignored. But his influence, through his teaching of generations of students, through his books and his 20-year editorship of his critical journal Scrutiny, was immense. Lewis collected from Arnold an overwhelming sense of responsibility for the continuity of English literary culture in the absence of any other living tradition, by which he meant Christianity and the rooted life of organic communities. In 1933, he wrote, "The fact that the other traditional continuities have so completely disintegrated makes the literary tradition correspondingly more important." 30 years later, he wrote proudly, quoting Arnold, that Scrutiny, his magazine, had been the result of his own, quote, "effort to maintain in Cambridge a community of critical intelligence which would make it possible for people widely separated in space and interest to discover the best that is known and thought in the world." His achievement was a more narrowly literary version of the Great Books programs in American universities, including the program I discovered this morning, founded here by Dr. Bird in 1950. For decades, the English syllabus owed much to Lewis. In the UK, and also in Australia, Canada, and India, and in South Africa until the Lewis students were driven out by apartheid, which they did. Sorry. He expected a student beginning a university English course to have come, unquote, to intelligent critical terms with, and made himself with personal conviction intelligently articulate about 2 or 3 of the great Shakespeare plays, 2 or 3 major novels, and some poems of diverse kinds by great poets. And his sentences are never easy to read. Hence, the poems of Donne, Blake, Hopkins, Lake Harvey, T.S. Eliot, the big novels of Dickens, the best novels of George Eliot, Conrad, James, Lawrence, were studied in the senior high school years, along with whole tales of Chaucer, 2 books of Paradise Lost, or a bunch of other works by Milton, and at least 2 Shakespeare plays, which had to be known in depth and in detail. In the last 25 years, I'm sorry to have to tell you, that the syllabus for public examination in English literature in the UK has thinned and softened almost beyond recognition. All this was Arnold's aspiration to become reality. Great plays, major novels, great poets. At the same time, personal conviction in that book I read you was the heart of the enterprise. We are here in Keats's vale of soul-making, for belief in the absolute value of the person was central to Lewis's approach to literature. Quote, "Only in living individuals is life there, and individual lives cannot be aggregated or equated or dealt with quantitatively in any way." These words come from Lewis's famous 2 Cultures lecture in 1962, his ferocious attack on C.P. Snow as a portent of trivialization and the gathering opinion that education in the sciences is the soul of confusion. I have to tell you that I was there at that lecture. It was 50 years ago, and I was an undergraduate, and I wasn't even studying English, but I knew people who were, and they said, "You must come. The old man's got this bee in his bonnet and he's going to be terrific." So I went. The lecture's subject is actually, I didn't realise it at the time, I was too young and too clueless about everything. The lecture's subtext is Lewis's warning against the threat of Marxist utopian materialism, which much impressed Snow. Neither of them brought it to the surface, neither Snow in his original two-cultures lecture, or Lewis in his brave rebuttal. That is the truth of that round, really. In the lecture, Lewis almost explicitly defended the study of English as a substitute for religious belief. This is here. For the sake of our humanity, our humanness, for the sake of the human future, we must do with intelligent resolution and with faith all we can to maintain the full life in the present, and life is growth of our transmitted culture. Lewis would have wholeheartedly agreed with the Cardinal Ratzinger's statement, we have need of roots if we are to survive, but not, alas, with the rest of the sentence, and we must not lose sight of God if we do not want human dignity to disappear. A university, according to Lewis, must be, quote, more than a collection of specialist departments. It must be, quote, a centre of human consciousness, perception, knowledge, judgment, and responsibility. And the centre of the university will therefore be, in a vital English school, a centre of consciousness and conscience for our civilization. A Christian is bound to ask, faith in what? Responsibility to what? Conscience, the voice of what? But just as Lewis was no more able than Arnold to acknowledge that belief in the absolute value of the person depends on belief in God, so it was as impossible for him as for Arnold to connect his sense of the value of the great writer with the absolutes of goodness, beauty, and truth united in God. Neither Lewis nor Arnold would have agreed with, but both would have been hard put to it to refute Nietzsche's note printed in The Will to Power. For a philosopher to say the good and the beautiful are one is infamy. If he goes on to add, also the true, one ought to thrash him. Truth is ugly. We possess art, lest we perish. Truth. Lewis repeated his call to arms for English in the university to the end. But years before his death, cracks had begun to open in his model of English as an academic subject. In 1965, in Cambridge itself, Lionel Trillian's lecture, The Two Environments, Reflections on the Study of English, referred to Lewis's Two Cultures lecture, but not to continue the attack on Snow. 3 years earlier, Trillian had criticised both Snow and Lewis in an acute essay in Beyond Culture. Trillian had a good deal in common with Lewis, but regarded him with reason as parochial. I expect that's what you think I am too. A cantankerous roundhead left over from the English Civil War. The other point. In 1965, Trillian defined with striking prescience a fresh distinction, that between a dreary academic closedness familiar to Sidgwick and Arnold, Philistine and dull, satisfied with its unexamined, unpromising beliefs, and a new environment which is an exhilarating but intellectually lazy development of what Arnold had hoped for and Lewis had established. This new environment, quote, identifies itself by its adherence to the imagination of fullness, freedom, and potency of life. Trillian referred to a recent Times Literary Supplement editorial lamenting that students of English no longer had the intellectual stamina for the English classics and wanted to study only modern literature. He quoted Graham Huff, who in The Dream and the Task, a very good book, had deplored the requirement that English should provide the foundations for feeling, conduct and belief for those who have no other source of supply. A literary religion without a system, without an ethic, without a creed. Huff's attack, not so much on Lewis as on what had already become of his teaching, was reinforced by Trin's amplification. His religion did have an ethic, and his ethic was selfishness. The new priorities were freedom, choice, fulfillment, life, style. That is, self-construction for public display. As far from the veil of soul-making as could be conceived. This now prevailing environment, Trin said, quote, still finds it to its purpose to call upon a pathos which is no longer appropriate to its size and strength. In other words, English departments were everywhere taking themselves extremely seriously, and teachers of English were aware that in the very structure of this environment there exists a trivializing force. Lewis's enterprise, in other words, had been the victim of its own success. Or more accurately, Lewis's rigorous standards of judgment, having no firmer philosophical or theological backing than his own vision of life and self-responsibility, had degenerated into a truth-free, value-free competition for attention, in which no person, text, or kind of behaviour was to be regarded as better than any other. So the academic study of English literature had become a prime example of the much wider phenomenon defined by Confronting as radical emancipation, a dangerous liberation derived from the post-enlightenment conviction that there is no truth outside or beyond what scientific method can prove. Lewis died in 1978. In an obituary essay, Terry Eagleton, educated in the Cambridge English of the 1960s, described the current state of the subject. There are various ways, he said, of making a university course in English more than spending 3 years reading a lot of poems, plays and novels that you might well have read anyway. This is his description of the scene. One way is to make the whole enterprise as boring and futile as possible, so that it at least acquires the trappings of academic respectability. If your students arrive from high school, flushed with enthusiasm about the spirit of man and creative imagination, you can beat them slowly into the ground by setting them to study watermarks, Elizabethan handwriting, textual revisions and Victorian book binding. Alternatively, you can encourage the handling of large, slippery abstractions like the creative imagination and fool yourself that what you're up to is some sort of displaced theology, thus a Marxist brought up as a Catholic. Or again, he added, you can try to turn the whole enterprise into a science, viewing literature as a logical system powered by its own laws. Eagleton was writing this in the early days of the march of theory, with capital T, as civilization once had a capital C. Anthony Julius, who studied English at Cambridge at just this time, the late 1970s, recently recalled the subject rigorously divided between Lewisite conservatives, all for the canon and for the redemptive power of literature, and the radicals, dismissive of both, as utterly untheorized in their enthusiasm for German, French, Marxist, Freudian, American theory, in any combination and however remote from any actual poem, play, or novel. One of the things, incidentally, that the march of theory has achieved has been the construction of a wall of jargon, excluding the ordinary educated reader from the discussion. Here's one recent example. I can't resist reading this. I'll do it quite quickly. To better understand the significance of this metro-pastoral space, we turn briefly to Bakhtin, whose discourse theory foregrounds the novel's ability to consume and reformulate weaker genres, resulting in parodic stylizations that engender laughter, irony, humour, elements of self-parody and semantic open-endedness, and whose theory of the time-place chronotype allows us to trace the bucolic pastoral idyllic chronotype from its origins in the lyric epic to its transvaluation in the Victorian novel. Since all novels contain a plethora of chronotypes and all chronotypes seek to replace, oppose, contradict, develop or dominate one another, it is not surprising that the idyllic chronotype squares off with the chronotype of theatrical space almost immediately in our mutual friend. It's just, well, this was in this year's Dickens Studies Manual. Just worth remembering that when our mutual friend came out in instalments in the 1860s, nobody had any problem reading novelty. As long ago as 1983, the English writer Geoffrey Strickland, in his own tribute to Leeds, gave a description of the subject most people will still recognise, I think here as well as in the UK. English is the name given to an educational programme which was almost unheard of in England 100 years ago, which has enjoyed enormous prestige since then, and which was once advocated in fairly unanimous terms. It now, of course, holds by sheer right of occupation a prominent place in the school and university syllabus, though it can no longer claim to be justified by any view of its purpose, which is shared by all or even the majority of those who teach it. Is all this cause for discouragement or even despair among those who teach, those who learn, those who want to learn English literature in the university? Certainly not. Good work is being done in university English departments by teachers, scholars and students who know that enthusiasm for reading more deeply, but understanding more exactly and more intelligently what is going on when a good writer uses words to attract, to interest, to move a reader, need not be quenched by fashionable scepticism. There is, as we have seen, much more at stake here than mere personal confidence that statements as to the comparative worth of text have actual meaning. A teacher needs to be able to explain to a student why it is worth spending time and trouble on a major text when a minor one might repay less effort with inadequate examination mark. If a text has the attractiveness, the seriousness, and the capacity to move the reader that makes it, in I. Richards's useful phrase, inexhaustible to meditation, the teacher needs to be able to confirm coherently the student's own awe at its quality. Some of these words are heavier than they might appear. Personal confidence in value that is real is faith. Attractiveness, seriousness, and the capacity to move describe imperfectly the beauty, truth, and goodness that in any human work are always partial, always relative, but not relative to nothing. In other words, the value Arnold and Leibniz recognised in great writing cannot become, as they hope, a substitute for the Christianity they thought discredited, but can be properly, that is rationally understood, only in relation to, or at least in relation to a sense of God as the source and guarantee of all beauty, truth, and goodness. Both Arnold and Leibniz would have been horrified by the confusion of different objectives and priorities, which has overcome the hope each of them invested in literature as the saving alternative to religion, in the face, in Leibniz's words, of the euphoric regardlessness of technological progress, which masks desperate human need. There is a striking American parallel here, may have occurred to you. Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, 1987, is like Leibniz's half-century of work in Fast Forward. Much wider ranging, much more flamboyant, very much more famous. Bloom, clearly a wonderful teacher, made a powerful case for literary education in Plato and Shakespeare above all, as essential nourishment for the soul. He knew perfectly well why nourishment of the soul leads. At the end of Love and Friendship, the book he dictated as he was dying, he acknowledged that at the top of the ladder of love, described in Plato's Symposium, Bloom's favourite work, there is God, and that Socrates is here in step with Christianity. But Bloom concludes his words, of course, this description is much less admissible by a philosopher who is by definition a doubter, than by a Christian, who is by definition a believer. End of quote. The notion of a Christian philosopher does not occur to him. And there you have it. Like Arnold Leavis, untrue. Bloom is sure it is too late, or he is too clever for faith. Probably both. Is there anything now, in the present fragmented and uncertain condition of English university, that can be reconnected to the grandeur of what all these writers thought to be the possible power and weight of literary study? Perhaps there is. Consider for a moment a figure whose influence on him Newman denied, and about whom Arnold and Leavis were loftily dismissive. Coleridge's Christian faith, both shaken and confirmed by the sufferings of his particular life, and by the German philosophy he worked hard to understand and then left to one side, set him apart from the other Romantic poets, and also from the other 19th century English sages, of whom he was the first. As early as 1796, when he was 24, he wrote in his notebook, "I have known some who have been rationally educated, as it is styled. They were marked by a microscopic acuteness, but when they looked at great things, all became a blank, and they saw nothing, and denied, very illogically, that anything could be seen." That, illogically, is very characteristic of Coleridge, and very nice juxtaposed with rationally like that. Coleridge started some uncatchable hairs in Biographia Literaria, but his definition of the imagination became one of them, only because most people discussing it found its anchorage in God impossible to acknowledge. This is familiar to everyone. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and firm agent of all human perception, and as a repetition of the finite mind of the eternal act of creation, the infinite I am. The secondary I consider as an echo of the former. Properly understood, this is a tentative but brilliantly illuminating attempt to connect the creative perceptiveness of the poet to that of any human being, and both to the eternal creativeness of God. As a suggestion of why great writing moves us, and why our sense of its value to us may be regarded as secure, but hasn't been improved on. A few years later, in one of the essays in The Friend, Coleridge wrote that, quote, "The living and substantial faith of the soul in God affords the sole sure anchorage in the storm, and at the same time the substantiating principle of all true wisdom. This alone belongs to and speaks intelligibly to all alike, the learned and the ignorant, if but the heart listens." If the sense persists in university English teaching that there is real value in great literature, value that is anchored in something reliable, it is likely to be reinforced by the truth, beauty, and goodness to be found in Shakespeare. Teachers, scholars, students, and school children continue to respond to Shakespeare with fascination, laugh, a recognition of enrichment that no other English writer delivers so often or at such depth. There are, of course, innumerable scholarly, historical, ethical, not to mention theoretical, ways of approaching Shakespeare. All begin, or should begin, from the initial response to the poet's words that Coleridge described as the response of the primary imagination, the prime agent of all human perception, to something produced by Shakespeare's superlative secondary imagination. If the Arnold Leavis project of replacing religion with literature hadn't been doomed by its fundamental mistake, the decision to regard literature as absolute and religion as relative, Shakespeare might have been its central and exemplary figure. But perhaps he can be the central and exemplary figure of a different project, the relocation of literature, of the study of English literature in particular, in relation to Christian truth. It's been the almost universal critical consensus of the last 2.5 centuries that Shakespeare's work is free of theology, free of philosophy, free of ethical bias. Dr. Johnson thought this so and deplored it. Shakespeare, he wrote, sacrifices virtue to convenience and is so much more careful to please than to instruct that he seems to write without any moral purpose. He makes no just distribution of good or evil. He inherits his persons indifferently through right and wrong, and at the close dismisses them without further care. Hazlitt, 50 years later, in the newly libertarian 19th century, rejoiced in what Johnson had deplored. The quality George Steiner in the 20th century, in agreement with Harold Bloom and many other critics, summed up Shakespeare's, quote, concrete universality, his observant neutrality in the face of the extant. The most notable exception to this consensus is Coleridge, who firmly and straightforwardly said that Shakespeare, quote, never rendered that amiable which religion and reason taught us to detest. He never clothed us in the garb of virtue. 5 years later, he wrote that in all his lectures at the Royal Institution, it had been his, quote, object to prove that the judgment of Shakespeare is commensurate with his genius. Nay, that his genius reveals itself in his judgment in its most exalted form. I would suggest that the security of Shakespeare's judgment, missed by Dr. Johnson, who was thinking in terms of rewards and punishments visible in this life, is a central element in his lasting appeal to people of different times and places, different levels of intelligence and learning, and even different languages and cultures. In many of the plays, the judgment Shakespeare presents to and evokes in his audience or his reader is complex, apparently open, suspended, but never absent. We may watch or read a play with our sympathies painfully divided between characters juxtaposed and contrasted in ways that Shakespeare does not resolve by bringing us finally to one side or the other. Many plays present us with pairs of characters whose motives and actions are mixed beyond any simple decision between good and bad. Richard II in Bolingbroke, Portia and Shylock, Falstaff and Hal, Brutus and Cassius, Antony and Octavius, Prospero and Caliban. We may not be given or come to a moral judgment at the end of these plays, but we are never left with the sense that therefore moral judgment is a meaningless concept. In other words, Shakespeare's sense that the final, the last judgment belongs to God is never absent from the number of each play. The tragedies, above all, evoke an audience or reader assent to the propositions that loyalty, trust, forgiveness, truthfulness, respect for the autonomy of others are good, and the betrayal of trust, lies, exploitation of others, and conscienceless pursuit of power are evil, and that the good approached and achieved in this life is beyond annulment and death. These propositions are theologically founded in God, whether those who regard them as sound know it or not. As Balthazar wrote about Shakespeare in the first volume of Theodrama, he knows the dimensions of the realm of evil, for he has an infallible grasp of what constitutes right action, and can translate the ethical into a sphere where, behind the moral squalor, the good heart shines through. So on the one hand, it is possible to read and to teach Shakespeare's plays or any other literary text, whether or not written by a Christian, against an absolute horizon that is the guarantee of its meaning. Or, on the other hand, literature has to be taught in the context of secular orthodoxy, in which truth, in Nietzsche's phrase, is no more than what your contemporaries will let you get away with. There are no other alternatives. Certainly not the substitution for religion of literature, the value of which, however great, will always be relative. Balthazar, in a theological discussion of freedom in the first volume of his Theologic, puts this as like this. The creature, by God's liberality, acquires a share in God's truth. And God reveals his truth precisely by granting participation in this way. God thus equips the creature to be a relative settler of truth. A kind of plenitude can descend upon the creature, and when it does, it gives the creature its greatest fascination. But it is so delicate, it requires such careful handling, that one has to have a completely ordered relation to God in order not to succumb to the temptation of divinizing the creature. This, though not intended as such, is an admirable description of any great writer, most particularly of Shakespeare. Harold Bloom, for example, wants us to worship instead of God. Shakespeare was probably a Catholic who kept his beliefs to himself because they were dangerous. There are many passages in the plays that can't be understood outside a Catholic context. But at a deeper level than the sectarian, there is a Christian assumption, a theist assumption, everywhere in Shakespeare, that the truth of the human life lies between the soul. Each of his kings was capable of penitence, from Richard II to Lear, comes down from whatever heights of arrogance, folly, and libido dominandum to a recognition of his common humanity in the uniqueness of his soul before God. And at a still deeper level, Shakespeare is only the greatest we have of all the writers in English, whether or not they are themselves Christian, whose imaginative openness to the structure of being reveals to us, through their words, our given direction towards the goodness, truth, and beauty, ultimately, of God, which is so often hampered by our pride, selfishness, and greed. Writers of integrity and depth get close to God because integrity and depth are bound to lead to God. We need to regain our confidence that this is so. In her challenging 2010 book, Absence of Mind, Marilyn Robinson leads with a sustaining of trust in the mind in relation to experience, in the value of the past in relation to the present, and in the soul, the person, in relation to God. Quote from Marilyn Robinson. The degree to which debunking is pursued as if it were an urgent crusade, at whatever cost to the wealth of insight into human nature that might come from attending to the record humankind has left, may well be the most remarkable feature of the modern period in intellectual history. And Professor McIntyre's book, God, Philosophy, Universities, makes a closely reasoned case for a Catholic context, theologically Augustinian, philosophical terms, within which coherence, which very coherence Leavists hoped in vain an English department could create, might return to all university studies. At present, subjects and disciplines, including philosophy and theology, and of course English, are self-contained, often mutually incomprehensible, full of internal disagreement, and unwilling to consider the unity in truth of different kinds of knowledge, or the nature and destination of the person. To quote Professor McIntyre once more, all adequate understanding is in the end a theological understanding, because in directing ourselves towards truth, we direct ourselves towards God. If Professor McIntyre's aspiration towards a new Catholic framework for all university study is to be realised, and of its prospects he will know it by heart, he only says that there is always more to hope for than we can reasonably expect. English would find within it a clear and definable place. Without McIntyre's framework, much could nevertheless be achieved by academics in English departments brave enough to think through and declare why they do what they do. Disinterested personal commitment is the key to fruitful study in either context. Although the Christian teacher of literature will obviously find his or her own intellectual development and that of his or her students easier to come by with the support and collective responsibility of God of a Christian institution. I will just end with a few instructive quotations. Trinity concluded his 1965 Cambridge lecture with a plea for university teachers of English to question whether preparing their students for the mere free-for-all of choice and opinion for radical emancipation is enough. He quoted a sentence from a letter of Keats, which he said, quote, should make the earth shake, although it does not, which should haunt our minds, although it does not. And this is Keats' sentence. Poetry, for all its energy and grace, is not so fine a thing as philosophy, for the same reason that an eagle is not so fine a thing as a truth. Coleridge, a few years earlier, wrote in The Friend, a few years earlier than Keats, that is, wrote in The Friend, I think it's beautiful, very Coleridge passage. Truth, considered in itself and in the effects natural to it, may be conceived as a gentle spring or water source, warm from the genial earth, and breathing up into the snowdrift that is piled over and around its outlet. It turns the obstacle into its own form and character, and as it makes its way, increases its stream. And should it be arrested in its course by a chilling season, it suffers delay, not loss, and waits only for a change in the wind to awaken and again roll on it. Saul Bayer had his unhappy academic Moses Herzog write, the people who come to evening classes are only ostensibly after culture. Their great need, their hunger, is for good sense, clarity, truth, even an atom of it. People are dying, it is no metaphor, lack of something real to carry home when day is done. 10 years later, Bayer himself said in a lecture, the living man is preoccupied with such questions as who he is, what he lives for, what he is so keenly and interminably yearning for, what his human essence is. And instead of the brave thought, he is offered conceptual stones and fashionable non-ideas. Bayer, the Russian Jew born in Canada who became the greatest American novelist in the second half of the 20th century, is Iron Bloom's great friend. But unlike Bloom, Bayer never lost his sense of wrong. His character, Mr. Simon, knows, quote, that there is the same truth in the heart of every human being, or a splash of God's own spirit, and that this is the richest thing we share. Bayer always recognized something that Pope Benedict has put in these words. Paul, in the first chapter of Romans, is far from regarding atheism or an agnosticism that is lived out as atheism as an innocent position. In his eyes, it is always the fruit of a refusal of that knowledge, which is in fact offered to man. One of the ways in which it is offered is through the great writers. The Pope again. Our greatest need in the present historical moment is people who make God credible in this world. We need people whose intellect is enlightened by the light of God, men whose hearts are opened by God, so that their intellect can speak to the intellect of others, and their hearts can open the hearts of others. As Augustine, to return to our beginning, wrote in Of Christian Teaching, a classroom guide for more than 1,000 years. But the human condition would be wretched indeed if God appeared unwilling to minister his word to human beings through human agency. There would be no way for love, which ties people together in the bonds of unity, to make souls overflow and, as it were, intermingle with each other, if human beings learn nothing from each other. Thank you. Yes, certainly could. I have taught over many, many years children from the age of 10 to the age of 18. And never underestimate the quality that children of 10, 11, 12 can cope with. A lot depends on your conviction, the teacher's conviction, that this is going to go, that this is going to work, that they're going to get it. I refused throughout a long teaching career to teach anybody anything that I thought was rubbish. This is actually quite unusual. But I have, for example, with mostly a bright bunch of 11 and 12-year-olds, I have done 4 Shakespeare plays in the year with 4 English classes a week, and they were also having to learn how to construct a proper sentence and how to all the other things they had to learn. And it was great, reading from the text on the desk. We did actually do performances of the opera plays. We did performances of Midsummer Night's Dream and The Tempest, cut by me, with nothing lost really. But the amazing thing was that little boys of 11 and 12 made such a lot of Julius Caesar, which is an office play to do with small children, that I bravely ventured on Antony and Cleopatra, which they thought was absolutely fantastic. I mean, of course, children don't understand every word as it goes by, but you get them swimming in the language, they forget that they're not understanding every word. I must just tell this very briefly down, when Antony's dying, when Antony and Cleopatra gets pulled up to the monument, and Cleopatra is dealing with a great death scene, one of these children said to me, "Can't she stop talking even now?" Well, that's right. He's got it. You know, he is seeing the point of what is happening. But even, you know, endless poems, all the great poems, the whole of the ancient minor. 11, 12-year-olds are absolutely gripped by the whole of the ancient minor, which is a great Christian poem. Apparently difficult poems by Hopkins. They can take on a lot. Children love it. And you've got to read them up to it, and you've got to be really keen on yourself that you can do it.
I wonder if you could say something about the way that studies here, and I was understanding more. The high school in teaching English has become not to find the best things but diversity. The most diversity. Different socioeconomic classes, everything else. So that, for example, when I read the Mariner, going to be read.
Well, it's a disaster, in my view, because there isn't time. There isn't time. They're different. Schools and universities. In school, you've got everybody, because everybody does some English literature, at least in England up to 16, and then the last 2 years they may not. They're going to be doctors and specialising in science subjects. You haven't got time for diversity. You can stick to the English classics, and you still haven't got time to read all these things they would appreciate. On university English courses, what is sad is that the narrow interests of specialisms within the study of literature, mostly with some kind of political agenda, gender studies, post-colonial studies, I mean, name it, it's a whole array of them, means that, yes, people can have an interesting time studying text from those particular points of view, but then they haven't read. They haven't read probably more than one Shakespeare play in the whole of their education. They may not have read one single Beck Victorian novel. They certainly won't have read, as I used to do with older 17, 18-year-olds. I used to fit in a sort of extra course on Russian literature to get boys who thought they couldn't read a novel reading Russian novels, because Russian novels are so thrilling that you would get boys reading novels who never read anything before in their lives. You know, people think Dostoevsky really, really difficult. But Crime and Punishment is a book that absolutely rivets any 17-year-old worth its salt. If you spread the things you feel you ought to be introducing the young to one, it just becomes too thin. And then nobody is reading anything difficult with real attention. And that is one of the points of the whole enterprise. And I was teaching most of my career in the Benedictine school surrounded by monks. And later at the dinner, which was something that quite a lot of the kids got used to and did, people assumed that reading scriptures and reading the fathers of the church is what lectures have been all about. Indeed, in the centre of the tradition, it is. But if you read King Lear in the same kind of spirit, you find all kinds of things that are going to stay with you for the rest of your life and be good. You can't do that without the time and the attention to spend maybe 2 weeks of an undergraduate course on it. And if you're cluttering up the scene with a whole lot of other stuff, there isn't time to do that, and that's very sad.
I think the point of the Newton quote was that there tends to be nature of the universe itself, the change of design and the study. I think there's lots to be said for that. In the middle case, if you go quite pride, it seems quite sharp between industry work that belongs within the university and literary criticism in the case of it, not just on the whole enterprise. It's not the kind of enterprise that's sort of examination in the right way, and so on. And I think that also explains sort of the various permutations that sort of gone through critical practice. But what seems striking to me is at the pre-university level, in my experience, I think in normal experience, both in the UK and the US, to ask students to produce literary criticism with actually this sense, without ever showing them literary criticism. So they read novels, but they have no models for intelligent critical response. Do you think there's something to be said for doing that?
Well, again, there's the time factor. I'd rather people read 3 Shakespeare plays instead of 2 than read 2 Shakespeare plays and some criticism, unless you're very, very careful about what criticism they read. Because you don't want them frightened off the project of coming to some kind of view of their own by sophisticated expressions of views by other people. I think everybody who's taken English literature seriously enough to be doing it in English terms as a special sixth form subject of end of high school kind of subject should certainly read some great criticism. Some carefully chosen bits of Johnson and Courage and Haskett maybe on Shakespeare, for example, or some of the great contentious stuff about Milton. But then nowadays, in English courses anyway, nobody's reading any Milton at all because it's too difficult. Milton is now not on the syllabus at all, and only just on a few university English literature courses, because the Latin isn't there. If you have absolutely no Latin, Milton really is seriously difficult to understand. And it's gone. And Chaucer the same. Chaucer's not nearly as difficult as Milton. But the people who left him out of the syllabus thought he must be more difficult because he's longer ago. That is the kind of level which these decisions are made.